Welcome to Stories of Slavery. In today's episode, we travel back to 1859, to the life of Thomas Wiggins, a young black boy forced into a life of exploitation, who could sit at a piano and play with the brilliance of Mozart, yet never spoke a single word. Many called it a miracle. But behind the applause lurked a darker truth that few dared to acknowledge. This is a difficult and intense story, so take a breath, steady yourself, and listen closely. Before we begin, please subscribe and drop a comment letting us know which city and country you're joining us from. Your participation helps ensure these stories are remembered, not buried. Let's begin. In the summer of 1858, inside a packed concert hall in Columbus, Georgia, something occurred that left the entire audience baffled. That night, more than 800 people had gathered. Wealthy plantation owners occupied the front rows, their wives dressed in silk and satin. Local politicians exchanged whispers. Newspaper reporters clutched their notebooks, eager for something worth recording. They had all paid good money to witness what the advertisements called the greatest musical curiosity in the American South. Yet, none of them were prepared for what they were about to see. The stage was simple. A grand piano, polished to a mirror shine, standing alone beneath the gaslight. The crowd fell silent as a white man in a tailored suit stepped forward and raised his hand. His name was James Neal Bethune, a lawyer and former newspaper editor who had built his wealth through land and enslaved people. He smiled at the crowd like a circus ringmaster introducing his main attraction. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "what you are about to witness will challenge everything you believe about the Negro race. What you are about to hear will make you question the very nature of God's creation. I present to you a boy who cannot read a single word, a boy who cannot write his own name, a boy whom doctors have declared mentally deficient, barely capable of feeding himself or dressing without help. And yet, this same boy will sit at this piano and perform feats of musical genius that the greatest composers in Europe could not rival." The audience murmured. Some laughed nervously. Others leaned forward in their seats. Bethune paused for dramatic effect, then gestured toward the side of the stage. "I give you Blind Tom." A small figure emerged from the shadows. He was 8 years old, though he appeared younger. His skin was dark, almost blue, black in the gaslight. His eyes were closed, veiled by thick, milky cataracts that had left him blind since birth. He moved with an odd, shuffling gait, his head bobbing slightly, his hands flapping at his sides in a strange, rhythmic motion. The audience gasped. Some women covered their mouths. A few men shook their heads in pity or disgust. This was not what they had expected. This was not a performer. This was a broken child, clearly damaged, obviously simple-minded. Several people began to rise, ready to demand their money back. But then the boy reached the piano. He needed no guidance to find the bench. He found it himself, his small fingers brushing against the wood until he located the keys. He sat down, adjusted his position, and placed his hands on the keyboard. The room fell silent. And then Thomas Wiggins began to play. The music that poured from that piano was unlike anything those 800 people had ever heard. It was Beethoven's Sonata Pathétique, one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire, a composition that professional musicians spent years trying to master. The blind child played it flawlessly. His fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed and precision. Every note was perfect. Every phrase was exactly as Beethoven had intended. The dynamics rose and fell like ocean waves. Soft as a whisper one moment, thunderous as a storm the next. When he finished, there was no applause. The audience sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Bethune smiled. He had seen this reaction before. if any gentleman or lady in the audience would like to test young Tom's abilities. He announced, "Please come forward. Play any piece of music you wish, no matter how complex, no matter how obscure. Tom will listen once and reproduce it exactly." A man in the third row stood up. He was a music teacher from Macon, a classically trained pianist who had studied in Philadelphia. He walked to the stage with a skeptical expression, sat at a second piano placed nearby, and began to play a complicated etude by Chopin, a piece filled with rapid scales and intricate fingerwork. Tom sat motionless, his blind eyes staring at nothing, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to something far away. The music teacher finished. He turned to Tom with a smirk, confident that this trick would end here. Tom placed his hands on his piano and played the etude back. In the 17th measure, the audience erupted. Over the next hour, person after person came to the stage to test the boy. A church organist played a hymn he had composed himself, a piece no one else in the world had ever heard. Tom reproduced it perfectly. A woman played a simple melody with her right hand while playing a completely different melody with her left. Tom played both simultaneously, then added a third melody of his own invention with his feet on the piano pedals. A German immigrant played a folk song from his homeland, singing the lyrics in German as he accompanied himself. Tom played the song back and hummed the melody in perfect pitch, even mimicking the man's German accent. By the end of the night, grown men were weeping. Women had fainted. The music teacher from Macon sat in his chair, with his head in his hands, muttering that he had wasted his entire life. And James Bethune stood at the side of the stage, counting the money in his head. That night in Columbus was not the first time Tom had performed, nor would it be the last. Over the next 5 decades, the blind boy from Georgia would become the most famous musician in America. He would play for presidents and generals. He would fill concert halls across the country and tour Europe to standing ovations. He would earn the equivalent of over $20 million in today's money. But Thomas Wiggins would never see a cent of it. He would never choose where to live, what to eat, or when to sleep. He would never have a friend, a wife, or a family of his own. He would remain, in every way that mattered, a slave, even after slavery ended, even after the law said he was free, even until the day he died. This is the true story of Blind Tom, the greatest musical genius America ever produced. And this is the story of how America destroyed him. Thomas Green Wiggins was born on May 25, 1849, on a plantation in Harris County, Georgia, near the small town of Columbus. His mother was a woman named Charity, sometimes recorded as Charity Green, who was owned by a man named Wiley Jones. Charity had already given birth to at least a dozen children, all of them scattered across different plantations, sold away from her over the years. Tom was her 13th child, and from the moment he was born, it was clear that something was different about him. The baby emerged from the womb with his eyes covered by thick white cataracts. He was completely blind, unable to see even shadows or light. But that was not the only thing wrong with him. In the days and weeks after his birth, Charity noticed that her son did not behave like her other children. He did not respond when she called his name. He did not look at her face when she held him. He did not cry when he was hungry or uncomfortable. He simply lay there, silent and still, as if he were somewhere else entirely. The other enslaved people on the plantation whispered that the child was cursed. Some said he had no soul. Others said he was punishment from God for some unknown sin. Even Charity, who loved her son despite everything, sometimes wondered if there was anything inside that small, silent body at all. In the fall of 1850, when Tom was about 18 months old, Wiley Jones decided to sell off some of his enslaved workers. He needed money to pay debts, and the slave market in Columbus was active. Jones gathered his healthiest workers and brought them to the auction block, where planters and farmers from across the region came to inspect the merchandise. Among the buyers that day was James Neal Bethune, a 46-year-old lawyer and newspaperman who had recently purchased a large plantation called Solitude in Muskogee County. Bethune had come to the auction looking for field hands, strong men who could clear land and plant cotton. But his attention was drawn to a woman standing at the edge of the group, clutching a small child in her arms. The woman was Charity. The child was Tom. Bethune examined them with the cold, calculating eye of a businessman. Charity was healthy and strong, probably good for another 15 or 20 years of work. But the child was clearly defective, blind, unresponsive, probably simple-minded. No one would pay good money for a slave who could never work. Wiley Jones knew this. That was why he was selling Charity and Tom together as a package. It was the only way to unload the damaged goods. Jones offered them at a steep discount, just $400 for the pair, a bargain price even by the standards of 1850. Bethune hesitated. He did not want to feed and clothe a useless child who would never contribute anything to the plantation. But Charity was a good worker, and the price was too low to pass up. He made the deal, and so Thomas Wiggins became the property of James Neal Bethune. Neither of them knew it at the time, but this transaction would change both of their lives forever. The first years at Solitude were hard for Charity and Tom. The plantation was new and undeveloped, with thick forests that needed to be cleared and swampy land that needed to be drained. Charity worked long hours in the fields, while Tom stayed in the slave quarters, cared for by older women who were too weak for heavy labor. As he grew, it became clear that Tom was unlike any child anyone had ever seen. He still did not speak. He showed no interest in playing with other children. He spent hours sitting alone, rocking back and forth, humming strange melodies to himself, running his fingers along any surface he could find. He seemed obsessed with sound. He would press his ear against the ground to hear the vibrations of footsteps. He would tap his fingers against walls and floors, listening to the echoes. He would sit outside during thunderstorms, his face turned toward the sky, drinking in the crash and rumble as if it were music. The other enslaved people did not know what to make of him. Some thought he was touched by spirits. Others thought he was simply an idiot, a damaged creature who would never amount to anything. The Bethune family ignored him entirely. He was just another slave child, and a broken one at that. He had no value, no purpose, no future. But everything changed one night in the summer of 1855, when Tom was 6 years old. The Bethune family had gathered in the parlor of the main house for an evening of music. James Bethune's daughters were taking piano lessons, as was expected of proper Southern young ladies, and their teacher had come to hear them practice. One by one, the girls sat at the Steinway grand piano that dominated the room and played their simple exercises, their small fingers stumbling over the keys. No one noticed the small figure crouched outside the window, hidden in the darkness. Tom had followed the sound of the music from the slave quarters. He had never heard a piano before, and the sound fascinated him. He pressed his face against the glass, his blind eyes staring at nothing, his entire body vibrating with the notes that floated through the air. When the lesson ended and the family went to bed, Tom did something that should have been impossible. He found his way to the back door of the house, which had been left unlocked. He navigated through rooms he had never been in before, avoiding furniture and obstacles by listening to the echoes of his own footsteps. He found the parlor. He found the piano, and he began to play. The sound woke the entire household. James Bethune grabbed his pistol, certain that an intruder had broken in. His wife and daughters huddled in terror. The overseer came running with a lantern. When they burst into the parlor, they found little Tom sitting at the piano bench, his blind eyes closed, his small fingers moving across the keys with supernatural grace. He was playing one of the pieces that Bethune's daughter had practiced earlier that evening. He was playing it perfectly. Bethune stood frozen in the doorway, his pistol hanging limp at his side. He watched the blind, mute, supposedly idiotic slave child perform music that his own daughters could barely manage after months of lessons. And in that moment, James Neil Bethune realized that he had stumbled upon something extraordinary. Over the following weeks, Bethune conducted what he called experiments on Tom. He brought in local musicians to test the boy's abilities. He had them play increasingly complex pieces, watching in amazement as Tom absorbed each one after a single hearing and reproduced it without error. He discovered that Tom could play with his hands crossed, with his back to the piano, even with a cloth draped over the keyboard, so he could not feel which keys he was pressing. The music seemed to flow through him from some unknown source, but there was more. Tom did not just reproduce music, he created it. He would sit at the piano for hours improvising melodies that no one had ever heard. Compositions that ranged from simple and sweet to dark and complex. The music poured out of him like water from a spring, endless and effortless and utterly original. Bethune was not a musical man himself. He could not read sheet music or play any instrument. But he recognized something that mattered far more in the antebellum South. He recognized an opportunity to make money. In 1857, when Tom was 8 years old, Bethune organized the first public exhibition of the boy's talents. He rented a concert hall in Columbus and plastered the town with advertisements. He promoted Tom not as an artist or a musician, but as a curiosity, a freak of nature, a marvel to be witnessed like a two-headed calf or a bearded woman at a circus. The show was a sensation. The concert hall sold out. People came from miles around to see the blind Negro boy who could play piano like a European master. Bethune charged 50 cents admission, a significant sum in 1857, and still turned people away at the door. By the end of the night, he had made more money than his plantation earned in a month. Bethune immediately began planning a tour. He pulled Tom away from his mother and the only home he had ever known. He loaded the boy into a carriage and set off across Georgia, then South Carolina, then the rest of the South, staging exhibition after exhibition in towns and cities large and small. The format was always the same. Bethune would give his speech about the savant, the mental defective who could somehow channel musical genius despite his damaged brain. Then Tom would play. Then the audience challenges would begin. Every night, local musicians would come forward to test the boy, certain they could stump him, certain the whole thing was a trick. Every night, Tom proved them wrong. The money rolled in. Bethune invested it in more advertising, more tours, bigger venues. By 1858, Blind Tom was the most talked about act in the American South. Newspapers ran breathless reviews of his performances. Scientists and doctors published papers trying to explain his abilities. Religious leaders debated whether his talent was a gift from God or a curse from the devil. And through it all, Tom remained a slave. He slept in back rooms and basements. He ate scraps and leftovers. He had no say in where he went, what he played, or how long he performed. Bethune owned him completely, body and soul. The question of how Tom developed his extraordinary abilities has puzzled researchers for over a century and a half. Modern experts now believe that he was almost certainly autistic, exhibiting what would today be classified as Savant syndrome, a rare condition in which individuals with developmental disabilities display exceptional abilities in specific areas such as music, mathematics, or memory. Tom showed many of the classic signs of autism throughout his life. He had difficulty with social interaction and communication. He engaged in repetitive behaviors like rocking and hand flapping. He showed intense focus on specific interests, particularly sound and music. He had sensory sensitivities that made certain textures and temperatures unbearable. And he possessed what appeared to be perfect pitch and an eidetic memory for music. Able to hear a piece once and store it permanently in his mind. In the 19th century, none of this was understood. The term autism would not even be coined until 1908, the year Tom died. In his own time, he was simply classified as an idiot, a person of such low intelligence that he was considered barely human. This classification was convenient for the white people who profited from him. If Tom was not really a person, not really conscious, not really human, then there was nothing wrong with using him like a trained animal. But the evidence suggests that Tom was far more aware than anyone gave him credit for. He responded to kindness and cruelty, showing visible distress when treated harshly and visible pleasure when treated well. He formed attachments to certain people and avoided others. He had preferences and desires, even if he could not express them in words. And most importantly, he had opinions about his own music. Bethune discovered early on that Tom could not be forced to play. If he was tired, hungry, or upset, he would sit at the piano in silence, no matter how much Bethune threatened or cajoled. If he did not like a particular piece of music, he would refuse to learn it, or would play it mockingly, exaggerating its flaws. And if he was in the mood to compose, he would ignore all requests and play only his own creations, sometimes for hours at a time. This was not the behavior of a mindless automaton. This was the behavior of an artist. By 1860, Blind Tom was the most famous musical performer in the American South. He had played for governors and senators. He had performed in the finest concert halls, from New Orleans to Richmond. He had been written about in newspapers across the country and in several European publications. He was, by any measure, a star. He was also still a slave. The question of Tom's legal status was complicated even by the standards of the time. James Bethune had purchased him as property, like a horse or a piece of furniture. But Tom was also a human being, at least in the eyes of God, if not the law, and his unprecedented abilities raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of intelligence and the justification for slavery. Southern apologists had long argued that Africans were mentally inferior to Europeans, incapable of higher thought, suited only for manual labor under white supervision. Blind Tom demolished this argument simply by existing. Here was a Negro, a slave, a person classified as property, who could outperform any white musician in the South. Here was proof that black minds were not inferior, that African blood did not preclude genius, that the entire intellectual foundation of slavery was a lie. Bethune was aware of this contradiction, and he worked hard to explain it away. In his advertisements and speeches, he emphasized Tom's supposed mental deficiency, his inability to care for himself, his animal-like nature. Tom was not really intelligent, Bethune insisted. He was merely a vessel, a freak of nature, a biological anomaly. His musical ability was not evidence of a sophisticated mind, but rather a kind of parlor trick, like a dog that could count or a horse that could tap its hoof in response to questions. Tom was remarkable, yes, but he was not human in the way that white people were human. This explanation satisfied most white audiences. It allowed them to enjoy Tom's performances without questioning their own beliefs about race. They could applaud his music while still believing in their own superiority. They could marvel at his abilities, while still supporting the system that kept him in chains. But not everyone was convinced. Abolitionists in the North seized on Blind Tom as evidence of slavery's injustice. How could anyone claim that Negroes were mentally inferior when a blind slave child could outperform the best white musicians in the country? How could anyone justify owning a human being who possessed such obvious genius? The debate over Tom intensified as the 1860 presidential election approached and the country lurched toward civil war. For Bethune, the timing was dangerous. If the Union won and slavery ended, he would lose his most valuable asset. Tom was worth more than the entire plantation, more than all of Bethune's other enslaved people combined. Losing him would be financial ruin, so Bethune took steps to protect his investment. In 1859, he drew up a legal contract with Tom's parents, Charity and her husband Mingo, who was enslaved on a nearby plantation. The contract stated that the Wiggins family agreed to let Bethune keep Tom and manage his career in exchange for a small annual payment and the promise that Tom would be well cared for. The contract was a sham. Of course, Charity and Mingo could not legally enter into contracts because they were enslaved. They could not negotiate terms because they had no leverage. They could not refuse because refusal meant punishment or sale. The document was designed to give Bethune a paper trail, something he could point to if Tom's ownership was ever challenged in court. And indeed, that challenge was coming sooner than anyone expected. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, and the Civil War began. The South seceded from the Union. James Bethune, a loyal Confederate, sent his sons to fight for the cause. He donated money and supplies to the Southern Army, and he continued to tour with Blind Tom, staging concerts across the Confederacy to raise funds and boost morale. Tom became, in effect, a propaganda tool for the Southern cause. Bethune presented him as proof of the benevolence of slavery, evidence that enslaved people were well cared for and even allowed to develop their talents under the wise guidance of their masters. Confederate newspapers praised Tom's performances as symbols of Southern culture and refinement. Confederate generals attended his concerts and shook Bethune's hand. What Tom thought about all of this, no one knows. He could not speak, could not write, could not express his opinions in any way that white people would recognize or respect. He simply played the music they asked him to play, performed the tricks they demanded, and kept whatever thoughts he had locked inside his silent mind. But perhaps the music itself was a form of expression, because during the war years, Tom began composing pieces with titles like The Battle of Manassas and March to the Battlefield, ostensibly celebrations of Confederate military victories. These compositions were hugely popular with Southern audiences, who heard in them the glory and triumph of their cause. But musicologists who have studied these pieces in recent decades have found something strange. Hidden within the triumphal melodies are darker elements, dissonant chords that sound like screams, rhythms that echo the crack of whips, minor, key passages that evoke sorrow and mourning rather than victory. Some researchers believe that Tom was encoding his true feelings about the war and about slavery into music that his white audiences could not fully understand. If this is true, then Blind Tom was not just a passive victim of the system that enslaved him. He was a secret rebel, expressing his resistance in the only language available to him, hiding his defiance in plain sight while white Confederates applauded and cheered. The war ended in April 1865 with the surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox. A month later, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, abolishing slavery throughout the United States. 4 million enslaved people were suddenly free, including Tom's mother, Charity, his father, Mingo, and every other black person in the South. Tom should have been free, too. He was 16 years old now, a young man who had spent his entire life performing for white audiences and earning money for white owners. He had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue, more than most free people earned in a lifetime. He deserved his freedom and the chance to control his own life and career. But James Bethune had other plans. Within months of the war's end, Bethune went to court and filed for legal guardianship of Tom. He argued that Tom was mentally incompetent, unable to care for himself, in need of a responsible white person to manage his affairs. He produced doctors who testified that Tom was an idiot, a creature with the mind of a young child, incapable of making decisions or handling money. He pointed to Tom's strange behaviors, his inability to speak, his apparent confusion about the world around him. The court agreed. In 1865, the same year that slavery ended, Thomas Wiggins was declared a legal ward of James Neal Bethune. Tom was free in name only. In practice, nothing had changed. Bethune still controlled where he lived, what he did, and where his money went. The chains had simply been replaced by paperwork, and so blind Tom's slavery continued. Hidden behind the legal fiction of guardianship, invisible to a nation that was trying to convince itself that the sin of slavery had been washed away. This was not unusual. Across the South, white people were finding new ways to control black labor, without calling it slavery. Black codes restricted where freed people could live and work. Vagrancy laws allowed police to arrest black people for being unemployed and force them to work without pay. Sharecropping trapped families in cycles of debt that lasted for generations. But Tom's situation was unique. He was not a field hand or a domestic servant. He was the most famous musician in America, a performer who had played for presidents, a genius whose abilities defied explanation, and he was still, in every way that mattered, a slave. The concert tours continued. Bethune took Tom north for the first time, staging shows in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. Northern audiences packed the halls, eager to see the famous blind Tom they had read about in newspapers. Abolitionists protested outside some venues, demanding Tom's freedom. But the shows went on, and the money kept flowing into Bethune's pockets. In 1866, Tom performed at the White House for President Andrew Johnson. It was one of the most prestigious engagements of his career. A command performance for the leader of the nation. Johnson was reportedly impressed. Though what Tom thought about playing for the man who was actively undermining Reconstruction and betraying the promises made to freed people remains unknown. By the end of the 1860s, blind Tom had earned the equivalent of several $1 million in today's money. He had performed hundreds of concerts across the United States and begun planning tours of Europe. He was, by any financial measure, one of the most successful entertainers of his era, and he still owned nothing. Not a house, not a dollar, not even the clothes on his back. Everything he had earned belonged to James Bethune. Everything he would ever earn would belong to James Bethune or his heirs. The guardianship arrangement ensured that Tom would remain a source of wealth for white people until the day he died. Tom's mother, Charity, watched all of this from a distance. After emancipation, she had stayed in Georgia, working as a domestic servant for various white families. She had no money, no education, no resources to fight for her son in court. She could only watch as her child was paraded across the country, performing for white audiences who saw him as a curiosity rather than a person. In 1870, Charity attempted to challenge Bethune's guardianship. She hired a lawyer, scraping together what little money she had, and filed suit demanding custody of her son. The case dragged on for years, mired in legal technicalities and deliberate delays. Bethune hired expensive attorneys who argued that Charity was unfit to care for Tom, that she lacked the resources and expertise to manage his career, that removing him from Bethune's care would destroy his livelihood. The court sided with Bethune. Charity lost her case and her son. She died a few years later, never having held Tom in her arms again, never having spoken to him without white people listening, never having seen him as anything other than a performer on a stage. And Tom played on. Night after night, year after year, a prisoner in the only world he had ever known. In the spring of 1882, a reporter from the New York Times traveled to the small town of Warrenton, Virginia, to interview the most famous musician in America. The reporter had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had heard the stories. The blind Negro boy who could play any piece of music after hearing it once. The idiot Savant who had performed for presidents and kings. The human curiosity who had earned millions of dollars without ever understanding what money was. But the reporter was not prepared for what he found. Thomas Wiggins was 32 years old now, no longer a boy, but a man. He sat in a small, dark room in the back of a boarding house, rocking slowly in a wooden chair. His eyes were still clouded with the cataracts that had blinded him since birth. His hair was starting to gray at the temples. His clothes were simple and worn, nothing like the fine suits he wore on stage. When the reporter entered, Tom did not acknowledge him. He continued rocking, humming a melody under his breath, his fingers tapping against his thighs as if playing an invisible piano. The reporter introduced himself and explained that he wanted to write a story about Tom's remarkable life. Tom said nothing. He simply kept rocking, kept humming, kept tapping. The reporter tried again, asking about Tom's childhood, his music, his travels across America and Europe. Still nothing. Tom seemed to exist in his own world, a place where reporters and their questions did not matter. Finally, the reporter asked if Tom would play something on the piano that sat in the corner of the room. For the first time, Tom stopped rocking. His head tilted slightly, as if considering the request. Then he stood up, walked to the piano without assistance, sat down on the bench, and placed his hands on the keys. What followed was unlike anything the reporter had ever heard. Tom played for nearly 2 hours without stopping. He moved through Beethoven and Mozart, through Bach and Chopin, through folk songs and hymns and popular melodies of the day. He played his own compositions, strange and beautiful pieces that seemed to come from some other dimension. He played with his eyes closed, with his back to the piano, with his hands crossed, with a handkerchief draped over the keys. When he finally stopped, the reporter sat in stunned silence. Tears were running down his face. Tom returned to his rocking chair and resumed his humming, as if nothing had happened. The reporter left Warrenton that afternoon and filed his story the next day. In it, he described Blind Tom as the greatest musical genius he had ever encountered. A man whose abilities defied all scientific explanation. But he also described something else. He described a prisoner, a man trapped in a life he had not chosen, controlled by people who saw him only as a source of income. A genius who had been robbed of everything except his music. The story caused a minor sensation, but nothing changed. Tom continued performing. His handlers continued collecting the money, and the world continued treating him as a curiosity rather than a human being. The years between 1870 and 1880 were the peak of Blind Tom's fame and earning power. He performed constantly, sometimes giving 2 or 3 concerts a day, traveling by train from city to city in an endless circuit of shows. He played in New York and Chicago, in San Francisco and New Orleans, in London and Paris and Berlin. He performed for Queen Victoria in England, who was reportedly so moved by his playing that she wept openly. He performed for Emperor Wilhelm I in Germany, who declared him the most remarkable musician in the world. But success did not bring freedom. James Bethune maintained iron control over every aspect of Tom's life. He decided where Tom would perform, how long the concerts would last, what pieces would be played. He negotiated the contracts, collected the fees, and deposited the money in his own accounts. Tom received nothing except food, clothing, and a place to sleep. The accommodations varied depending on location. In some cities, Tom stayed in fine hotels, though always in back rooms or servants' quarters. In other places, he slept in boarding houses or even in the homes of local black families who were paid a small sum to house him. He rarely stayed anywhere for more than a few nights. The schedule was relentless, designed to extract maximum profit from every tour. Tom's health suffered under this brutal regime. He was frequently exhausted, sometimes performing while visibly ill. He had episodes of confusion and agitation, behaviors that would today be recognized as signs of autistic burnout or sensory overload. When these episodes occurred, Bethune would cancel shows until Tom recovered, not out of concern for Tom's well-being, but because a sick performer could not generate revenue. There were other costs as well, costs that did not show up on any balance sheet. Tom had no friends. He had no romantic relationships. He had no connection to the black community that might have embraced him as one of their own. He existed in a strange limbo, too famous to be anonymous, too controlled to be free. He was surrounded by people constantly, but he was utterly alone. The few accounts we have of Tom's inner life during this period come from brief moments when the mask slipped. A stagehand in Philadelphia reported that Tom sometimes cried at night, sobbing quietly in his room for hours. A hotel maid in Boston said that Tom once grabbed her hand and held it for several minutes. Not in a threatening way, but in a desperate, lonely way, as if he simply needed human contact. A music critic in London wrote that Tom seemed to brighten when children were present, playing silly songs and making funny sounds to make them laugh. The only times he ever appeared genuinely happy. But these glimpses were rare. For most of his life, Tom remained a mystery, locked inside his own mind, communicating only through his music. In 1875, James Bethune decided to transfer legal guardianship of Tom to his son, John Bethune. The elder Bethune was getting old, and he wanted to ensure that the family would continue to profit from Tom after his death. The transfer was accomplished through the courts, with Tom having no say in the matter. He was simply passed from one owner to another, like a piece of furniture or a farm animal. John Bethune was a different kind of master than his father. Where James had been cold and calculating, John was volatile and cruel. He drank heavily and had a violent temper. He saw Tom not as a valuable asset to be protected, but as a personal possession to be used however he wished. Under John's management, Tom's life became even harder. The touring schedule intensified. The accommodations grew worse. John frequently berated Tom in front of others, mocking his disabilities, calling him names, threatening him with punishment if he did not perform to expectations. There are reports that John sometimes struck Tom, though the details are unclear. What is certain is that Tom's behavior changed during this period. He became more withdrawn, more prone to episodes of distress, more resistant to performing. But Tom had no way to escape. He could not see. He could not navigate the world without assistance. He had no money, no connections, no understanding of how to survive on his own. He was as trapped as any slave had ever been. Even though slavery had officially ended a decade earlier, the year 1882 brought a new complication to Tom's already difficult life. John Bethune's wife, Eliza, filed for divorce, citing her husband's drinking, violence, and infidelity. The divorce proceedings were bitter and public, with both sides airing their grievances in court and in the newspapers. At the center of the dispute was blind Tom. Eliza argued that she should receive custody of Tom as part of the divorce settlement. She claimed that she had been more involved in managing Tom's career than her husband, that she had treated him better, that she was better equipped to care for him. John countered that Tom was his property, inherited from his father, and that Eliza had no claim to him. The case dragged on for years, moving through various courts and appeals. Tom was never consulted. His preferences were never considered. He was simply a prize to be won, a source of income to be fought over. In 1887, the courts finally ruled in Eliza's favor. She was awarded custody of Tom, along with a portion of his future earnings. John Bethune was ordered to turn Tom over to his ex-wife and to cease all involvement in his career. Tom was 38 years old. He had been performing professionally for over 30 years. He had earned millions of dollars, and he had just been transferred from one white owner to another. His fate determined by lawyers and judges who had never asked him what he wanted. Eliza Bethune proved to be a somewhat better guardian than her ex-husband. If only because she was less cruel. She reduced Tom's touring schedule slightly and improved his living conditions. She allowed him more rest between performances and made sure he had adequate food and clothing. But she was still motivated primarily by profit, and she still saw Tom as a commodity rather than a person. Under Eliza's management, Tom continued performing throughout the late 1880s and into the 1890s. He was older now, and his fame had faded somewhat. The novelty that had once packed concert halls was wearing off. Younger performers were capturing the public's attention. The newspapers that had once breathlessly reported on Tom's every appearance now barely mentioned him. But Tom could still draw a crowd, especially in smaller towns and cities where he had never performed before. Eliza focused on these secondary markets, booking Tom into smaller venues for lower fees. The tours were less glamorous than they had been in the 1870s, but they were still profitable. During this period, Tom began to show signs of age and decline. His memory, once seemingly infinite, started to falter. He would sometimes forget pieces he had played hundreds of times. He would lose his place in the middle of a performance and have to start over. His improvisations became less fluid, less inspired. The genius was still there, but it was flickering. Tom also became more difficult to manage. He would sometimes refuse to perform, sitting at the piano in silence, no matter how much Eliza pleaded or threatened. He would play pieces that were not on the program, ignoring requests from the audience. He would stop in the middle of a concert and walk off stage without explanation. These incidents were unpredictable and increasingly frequent. Some historians have interpreted this behavior as a form of resistance. Tom's only way of asserting control over his own life. He could not speak, could not escape, could not fight back physically, but he could refuse. He could sit in silence. He could deny his captors the one thing they wanted from him. In a life defined by powerlessness, this small rebellion may have been Tom's only source of agency. Others have suggested that Tom's behavior was simply a result of aging and mental decline. He was approaching 50, ancient by the standards of the time, and his brain was no longer functioning as it once had. The strange behaviors that had always characterized him were becoming more pronounced, more disruptive, more difficult to manage. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. By the mid-1890s, blind Tom was no longer the reliable money-making machine he had once been. His performances were inconsistent. His audiences were shrinking. His earning power was declining. Eliza Bethune, who had fought so hard to gain control of him, was beginning to wonder if he was worth the trouble. In 1898, something remarkable happened. A lawyer named Albion Torgay, a white man who had been a Union soldier during the Civil War and had dedicated his life to fighting for civil rights, took an interest in Tom's case. Torgay was famous for having argued Plessy v. Ferguson before the Supreme Court, the landmark case that, unfortunately, established the separate but equal doctrine that would govern American race relations for the next half-century. Though he had lost that case, Torgay remained committed to the cause of racial justice. Torgay believed that Tom was being held illegally, that the guardianship arrangement was a violation of his constitutional rights. He filed suit on Tom's behalf, arguing that a competent adult could not be held as a ward without his consent, that the guardianship laws were being abused to perpetuate a form of slavery, and that Tom deserved the right to control his own life and earnings. The case attracted significant attention. Newspapers across the country covered the proceedings. Editorials were written debating the merits of the arguments. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Tom might finally be freed, but the courts disagreed. Judge after judge ruled that Tom was indeed mentally incompetent, that he required a guardian to manage his affairs, that the arrangement with Elizabethan was legal and appropriate. The evidence of Tom's disabilities was overwhelming, they said. He could not speak. He could not care for himself. He could not understand money or contracts or the complexities of the world. Without a guardian, he would be helpless. Torgay appealed, but the higher courts affirmed the lower court rulings. The case was closed. Tom remained Elizabethan's property in all but name. Torgay died in 1905, still fighting for causes he believed in. Tom outlived him by 3 years. The final decade of Tom's life was marked by obscurity and decline. Elizabethan had largely given up on touring by 1900. The costs of travel and accommodation were no longer justified by the dwindling audiences. Tom was kept in a small house in Hoboken, New Jersey, cared for by hired servants, trotted out occasionally for private performances when Eliza needed money. Few visitors came to see him. The newspapers had long since moved on to other stories. The musical world had evolved, embracing new styles and new stars. Blind Tom, once the most famous performer in America, was largely forgotten. But Tom still had his music. He still played every day for hours at a time, alone in his small room with a battered upright piano. He played the pieces he had learned decades earlier. The Beethoven and Mozart and Bach that had once brought audiences to their feet. He played his own compositions, the strange and beautiful melodies that had emerged from his unique mind. He played for no one except himself. What did Tom think during those long, lonely hours at the piano? What memories did he carry? What emotions did he feel? We will never know. He could not tell us. He could only play. In 1904, Elizabethan was interviewed by a reporter who was writing a retrospective article about Tom's career. She described him as a simple creature, content with his lot, grateful for the care she provided. She said he was like a child, innocent and happy, unaware of the world's complexities. But others who saw Tom during this period painted a different picture. A servant who worked in the Hoboken house said that Tom often seemed sad, sitting for hours in silence, refusing to eat or engage with anyone. A neighbor reported hearing Tom play the same mournful melody over and over late at night, the sound drifting through the walls like a ghost. A doctor who examined Tom in 1906 noted that he showed signs of depression and withdrawal, common in individuals who had experienced prolonged isolation and lack of stimulation. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Tom was neither the contented innocent that Eliza described nor the tragic figure that others portrayed. He was a complex human being with thoughts and feelings and experiences that we can only guess at. He had lived an extraordinary life, one filled with triumph and tragedy, fame and exploitation, genius and suffering. And now that life was coming to an end. On June 13, 1908, Thomas Green Wiggins died of a stroke at the age of 59. He was alone when he died, in his small room in Hoboken, far from the concert halls where he had once performed and the plantation where he had been born. His death was reported briefly in a few newspapers, mostly as a curiosity, a footnote to an earlier era. The headlines called him Blind Tom, the name his owners had given him, the name that reduced his entire existence to a disability and a nickname. Few mentioned his full name. Few acknowledged his humanity. Few mourned his passing. Elizabethune arranged for a modest funeral. Tom was buried in Evergreen Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, in an unmarked grave. The man who had performed for presidents and queens, who had played in the finest concert halls on 2 continents, who had earned millions of dollars over his career, was laid to rest without even a stone to mark his place. For nearly a century, no one knew where Thomas Wiggins was buried. His grave was lost, forgotten like the man himself. It was not until 1976 that researchers finally located his remains, in a plot that had been purchased by Elizabethune under her own name rather than Tom's. In 2002, a proper marker was finally placed on Tom's grave. It reads, Thomas Wiggins Bethune, Blind Tom, 1849 to 1908, renowned pianist and composer. The marker acknowledges both his slave name and his stage name, the identities imposed on him by white owners who saw him only as a source of profit. But the marker also calls him what he truly was, a pianist, a composer, an artist. It took 94 years for America to put those words on his grave. 94 years to acknowledge that Thomas Wiggins was more than a curiosity, more than a freak, more than a piece of property. He was a musician, one of the greatest who ever lived. The story of Blind Tom raises uncomfortable questions that America has never fully answered. How do we reckon with the exploitation of black genius? How do we account for the wealth that was extracted from enslaved and formerly enslaved people? How do we honor those who were robbed not just of their freedom, but of their very identities? Tom earned the equivalent of over $20 million during his career. Every penny of that money went to white people. First to James Bethune, then to John Bethune, then to Eliza Bethune. The family that had purchased Tom as a defective piece of property became wealthy beyond imagination because of his talent. And what did Tom receive in return? A room to sleep in, food to eat, clothes to wear. The bare necessities of survival, provided not out of kindness, but out of the need to keep the money-making machine functioning. This was the reality of Blind Tom's life. He was not a person but a product, not an artist but an attraction, not a human being but a human tool used to generate profit for others. Some defenders of the Bethunes have argued that they deserved compensation for managing Tom's career, that without their efforts he would have remained an unknown slave on a Georgia plantation, that they provided him with opportunities he could never have had on his own. There is a kernel of truth in this argument. Tom could not have managed a concert tour by himself. He could not have negotiated contracts or handled finances. He needed help to navigate a world he could not see. But this argument ignores the fundamental injustice at the heart of the arrangement. Tom did not choose to have managers. He did not consent to the terms of his employment. He did not agree to give away all of his earnings in exchange for food and shelter. These decisions were made for him, without his input, by people who had a financial interest in keeping him dependent and controlled. A truly just arrangement would have looked very different. Tom could have been paid fairly for his work, with a portion of his earnings set aside for his care, and the rest saved for his future. He could have been provided with education and support to help him develop whatever independence was possible given his disabilities. He could have been treated as a human being with rights, rather than as property to be exploited, but that would have required white America to see Tom as a person. And white America was not ready to do that. Not in 1858 when he first began performing, not in 1865 when slavery officially ended, not in 1908 when he died. The myth of black inferiority was too powerful, too convenient, too deeply embedded in the fabric of American society. So Tom lived and died as a slave in everything but name, and his story was mostly forgotten. A footnote in the history of American music, an uncomfortable reminder of truths that most Americans preferred not to face. But here is the remarkable thing about Thomas Wiggins. Despite everything that was done to him, despite the exploitation and the cruelty and the dehumanization, he left something behind that his oppressors could never take away. He left his music. Tom composed over 100 original pieces during his lifetime. Many of these compositions have been lost, never written down or preserved. But some survive, and they reveal a mind of extraordinary depth and complexity. His most famous composition is the Battle of Manassas, a musical depiction of the Confederate victory in the first major battle of the Civil War. On the surface, it seems like a celebration of Southern triumph, exactly the kind of propaganda that James Bethan wanted Tom to produce. But listen closely, and you hear something else. You hear chaos and confusion. You hear suffering and death. You hear the true horror of war rendered in notes and chords that white audiences applauded without understanding. Another composition, The Rainstorm, captures the sound of a violent thunderstorm with uncanny accuracy. The piece begins quietly, with soft raindrops falling on a roof. Then the wind picks up, the rain intensifies, the thunder crashes. The music builds to a terrifying climax before gradually subsiding into peaceful calm. It is a work of programmatic genius, painting pictures with sound in a way that few composers have ever matched. But perhaps the most revealing of Tom's compositions are the ones without names. The improvised melodies that he played for himself late at night, alone in whatever room he happened to be sleeping in. These pieces were never performed publicly, never written down, never intended for any audience. They were Tom's private language, his way of expressing thoughts and feelings that he could not put into words. Witnesses who heard these private performances described them in almost mystical terms. They spoke of music that seemed to come from another world, melodies that were unbearably sad or strangely joyful, or simply beyond human comprehension. They spoke of feeling as if they were eavesdropping on something sacred, something that was not meant for their ears. What was Tom saying in these private moments? Was he mourning the mother he lost? Was he raging against the captivity he endured? Was he dreaming of a freedom he would never experience? Was he simply expressing the pure joy of creating, the one pleasure that could not be taken from him? We will never know for certain, but we know that he played every day for 50 years. He played through slavery and war, through poverty and exploitation, through loneliness and despair. He played. The music was his refuge, his rebellion, his revenge. It was the one part of his life that belonged entirely to him. And in the end, that music is what survived. The Bethuns are forgotten, their names remembered only because of their connection to Tom. Their money is long since spent. Their power is long since dissolved. But Tom's compositions are still performed today, studied by musicologists, marveled at by pianists, appreciated by audiences who never knew his name. In this sense, Tom won. Not the victory he deserved, not the freedom and respect and compensation he should have received, but a victory nonetheless. His genius outlasted his oppressors. His art transcended his suffering. His music carries his story forward, speaking to generations who never knew him, testifying to what he was and what was done to him. There is a lesson in this, though it is not a comfortable one. The lesson is not that talent conquers all, or that genius will always be recognized, or that justice eventually prevails. Tom's life proves the opposite. Talent can be exploited. Genius can be imprisoned. Justice can be delayed forever. The lesson is simpler and more profound. It is that human beings are more than what is done to them. They are more than the categories imposed on them. They are more than the names they are called or the roles they are forced to play. Tom was called an idiot, but he was a genius. He was called property, but he was a person. He was called Blind Tom, as if blindness and a nickname could define him. But he was Thomas Green Wiggins, a man with a mother who loved him, a mind that created beauty, and a soul that endured. The people who exploited him wanted to reduce him to a commodity, a curiosity, a thing. They wanted to extract value from him without acknowledging his humanity. They wanted to profit from his gifts while denying that he had any inner life worth respecting. They failed. Not in the material sense. They took his money, controlled his body, owned his labor. In that sense, they won completely. But they failed to erase him. They failed to silence him. They failed to make him nothing. Because Tom spoke not in words but in music. Every time he sat at the piano, he spoke. Every composition was a statement. Every performance was a testament. Every note was proof that inside the body they called defective. Inside the mind they called inferior. Inside the person they treated as property, there was something real and valuable and irreducibly human. This is what we should remember about Blind Tom. Not just the injustice of his life, though that must never be forgotten. Not just the cruelty he endured, though that must be acknowledged and condemned, but also the triumph. The triumph of a man who, in the face of everything designed to destroy him, continued to create, continued to express, continued to be. Tom never got his revenge in any conventional sense. He never confronted his oppressors, or escaped their control, or received compensation for what was stolen from him. He died as he had lived, at the mercy of white people who did not see him as fully human. But there is another kind of revenge. The revenge of endurance, the revenge of survival, the revenge of leaving something behind that your enemies cannot destroy. James Bethune is dust. John Bethune is dust. Eliza Bethune is dust. Their grand plans, their legal maneuverings, their careful exploitation, all of it is dust. But somewhere, right now, someone is playing one of Tom's compositions. Somewhere, right now, someone is hearing his music for the first time and feeling something stir inside them. Somewhere, right now, his genius is touching another human being across a gap of more than a century. That is Tom's revenge. Not violent, not dramatic, not satisfying in the way that Hollywood endings are satisfying, but real and lasting and true. The boy who never spoke a word said everything that mattered. He said it in music, and we are still listening. In recent years, there has been a growing movement to recognize Tom's contributions to American music, and to reckon with the injustice of his life. Musicologists have studied his compositions in depth, analyzing their structure and meaning. Historians have uncovered new documents about his life, adding detail and nuance to our understanding of what he experienced. Performers have recorded his works, bringing his music to new audiences. There have also been calls for more tangible forms of recognition. Some have suggested that Tom should be inducted into various music halls of fame. Others have proposed that a museum or memorial should be established in his honor. Still others have called for reparations, arguing that the Bethune family's descendants should be required to give back some portion of the wealth that was extracted from Tom's labor. These efforts are valuable. They help to correct the historical record, to ensure that Tom is remembered as he should be remembered. But they also raise difficult questions. Can any recognition, however belated, make up for what was done? Can any memorial capture the full weight of a life spent in captivity? Can any reparation compensate for 50 years of stolen freedom? The answer probably is no. There is no way to undo what was done to Tom. There is no way to give him back the life he should have had. The injustice of his existence is complete and irreversible. But perhaps that is not the point. Perhaps the point is not to fix the past, but to learn from it. To see in Tom's story a warning about what happens when human beings are treated as property. To recognize in his suffering the consequences of systems designed to extract value from black bodies while denying black humanity. To understand that the history of American music, like the history of America itself, is built on a foundation of exploitation and theft. Tom's life was shaped by forces beyond his control. He was born into slavery, sold as property, exploited as a performer, kept as a ward, and forgotten after his death. At every stage, decisions were made for him rather than by him. His fate was determined by laws and customs and economic interests that he could not influence or escape. And yet, within those constraints, he found a way to be himself. He found a way to create. He found a way to leave a mark on the world that would outlast the people who owned him. This is the paradox of Tom's life. He was utterly powerless, and yet he was powerful. He was silenced, and yet he spoke. He was treated as nothing, and yet he was something. Something extraordinary, something unforgettable, something that we are still trying to understand. If Tom could speak to us today, what would he say? Would he be angry at the people who exploited him? Would he be sad about the life he was denied? Would he be proud of the music he created? Would he even care what we think, more than a century after his death? We will never know. Tom's thoughts died with him, locked forever inside the mind that the world called defective. But we have his music. And in that music, if we listen carefully, we can hear something that sounds like a voice crying out from the darkness, a voice demanding to be heard, a voice insisting on its own existence, its own value, its own humanity. Listen to that voice. Listen to Blind Tom. Listen to Thomas Wiggins. He has something to tell you. In the end, what Thomas Wiggins gave to the world was not just music. It was proof. Proof that genius knows no color. Proof that the human spirit cannot be crushed by chains or laws or cruelty. Proof that even in the darkest circumstances, something beautiful can emerge. The people who exploited Tom wanted to prove the opposite. They wanted to use him as evidence that black people were inferior, that slavery was justified, that the social order of the antebellum South was natural and right. They paraded him on stages across America and Europe, presenting him as a freak, an anomaly, a demonstration of how far a defective Negro could go with proper white management. But their argument collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. If black people were truly inferior, how could a blind, allegedly idiotic slave child outperform the best white musicians in the world? If Negroes were only suited for manual labor, what explained the creative genius that poured from Tom's fingers every time he touched a piano? If the system of slavery and white supremacy was just, why did it require such elaborate justifications? Tom's existence was a refutation of everything his oppressors believed. Every note he played was an argument against their worldview. Every composition was evidence that their ideology was built on lies. They tried to explain him away. They called him an idiot savant, a freak of nature, a biological accident. They insisted that his abilities did not reflect true intelligence, that he was merely imitating sounds like a parrot, that there was no real mind behind the music. But anyone who actually listened could hear the truth. The music was not mechanical. It was not empty imitation. It was art. It was expression. It was the product of a consciousness that felt and thought and created. Tom proved them wrong simply by being who he was. He did not need to argue or protest or fight. He just had to play. And every time he played, the lies fell away. This is the legacy of Blind Tom. Not just the compositions he left behind, though those are precious and irreplaceable. Not just the historical record of his exploitation, though that must be preserved and taught. But the simple, irrefutable fact of his genius. The proof that black minds are not inferior. The evidence that human potential cannot be measured by the color of someone's skin. That proof was paid for with a lifetime of suffering. Tom gave everything so that this truth could be demonstrated. He sacrificed his freedom, his earnings, his relationships, his happiness. He endured exploitation and cruelty that would have broken most people. And in return, he got nothing except the chance to play. But that chance was enough. Through his music, Tom transcended the prison that surrounded him. Through his art, he escaped the categories that were meant to contain him. Through his genius, he defeated the ideology that tried to define him as less than human. This is the revenge of Blind Tom. Not a revenge of violence or destruction. Not a revenge that left his oppressors bleeding in the streets. But a revenge of truth, a revenge of beauty, a revenge of enduring proof that they were wrong about everything. The boy who never spoke a single word had the last word after all, and that word was music.